servanthood of our brother, Dr. Anthony Look. Brother Dr. Anthony Look was a seminarian teacher for many, many years. But now I believe he's kind of a freelancing, if I may use that word. He teaches Hebrew. Whilst he focuses on Old Testament, he is a biblical scholar with a pastoral heart. I say that because I shared a session on the book of Micah with him. And there I was supposed to be moderating, but I also became some sort of a discussant. But this evening, we only have an hour or 40 over minutes where Dr. Anthony Look will compress his two major sessions. He had two major sessions on this topic, but because of the scheduling, he's asked to compress it. So today we are going to examine a vital topic of the thematic called war. And as we are aware, if we read the Bible realistically and carefully, from the very beginning of Genesis through to the last book, there are violence and there is conflicts, whether or not in Genesis or through the Promised Land or in the exilic literature. And I remember Dr. Anthony Look has written a very warm and expository book on the book of Lamentations. In fact, I was tempted to open up today's session with a short reading from that. How lonely is the city that sits because women are widowed, their husbands are taken away, and the children are slaughtered. These issues pervade all our lives, and not just far away. I just picked up a book called Forgotten Wars in Asia, and I'm reminded, although none of us lived through the war, I believe, all right, our forefathers lived through the Japanese War, and much of the political ramifications are spelled out because of post-war and colonial construct. But that is a discussion for another day. This evening, we have Dr. Anthony Look, who will take us through a vital question as to whether war can ever be justified. He will examine for us both biblically in a quick overview and also theologically and historically the great Christian thinkers who have wrestled with these issues. And by the very nature that we only have an hour in our audience, Dr. Anthony Look will only be able to give us a conspectus of some of the views which he will share with us this evening. We now hand over the session to our brother, Anthony Look. Over to you, Anthony.
Thank you, Philip. And thank you to the organizers for the invitation. Okay, let me put up the slide. Okay. There are notes available, which will probably be posted maybe in the chat, and then you can use them as well. So I've been given this topic, and as Brother Philip says, it's actually a compression of two papers, one on war and violence, and one, of course, was on the just war theory. Let me begin by reading a text from one book, and that is the book of Esther, in which I've actually written a very simple exposition. When we come to chapter 9, in the aftermath of the planning by that wicked Haman to exterminate the Jews, and then, of course, through God's providence, the plan was exposed and the Jews knew about it, and then they began to turn the tables. In chapter 9, verse 1, it says, "Now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and on the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and the edict was about to be carried, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them." And then we jump to verse 16. "Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives, and got relief from their enemies and killed," notice the number, 75,000 of those who hated them. "But they laid no hands on the plunder." I would say this is a very disturbing text because immediately we can see the Jews here are God's people, and they are taking, violence into their own hands in order to defend themselves. And it raises also a whole issue about killing. I noticed the number is not just a few, it's 75,000. And the context, of course, was the planned genocide of the Jews by that wicked Haman. And with God's help, the Jews managed to turn the tables. And in the end, it's the Jews actually end up killing their enemies. And and all this happened in the Persian Empire between two groups of citizens. And so we can look at it as an inter-Nicene conflict between two particular groups. And so that raises a lot of problems because you can see the killing, the violence, and the war. When we look at the whole issue of violence and war, there are actually two topics which are intertwined. It's actually very difficult to separate them. Whenever we touch about war, you have to talk about violence. You talk about violence, you have to talk about war. Okay, so we just don't have time to actually do two topics together. If you want to read a bit more about violence, especially in the Old Testament, because that is often the area where non-Christians will point to the Christians and say, see, your Old Testament, you have all this fighting and violence. A very good book is by Susan Nidish's book called War in the Hebrew Bible, a study of violence in the Old Testament. And she will look at some of those difficult texts where, especially in Joshua and others, you see the command to do almost what's called holy war. And violence actually is part of the Abrahamic religions. Bruce Chilton's book, I think it is still a classic today because it talks about Abraham's curse, the roots of violence in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And 8 years ago, we in STM did a seminar, and we did a topic on this, confronting violence in the Abrahamic religions, religious resources and a response. So myself and Dr. Patricia Ann Martinez were the co-presenters. I covered the Old Testament and New Testament and a bit of the intertestamental period, while Dr. Martinez covered the aspect of Islam. So it is a very pertinent topic which we find ourselves being confronted today. But because of time today, we can only focus on this topic: can war be justified? We're not talking about whether war will not happen or will happen. We're talking more about, can war be moral? Can there be a case where it is justified to go to war? Okay, because sometimes we don't realize that it's so easy to discuss this topic from an armchair perspective. What if our nation, Malaysia, is actually invaded by a foreign power? Maybe by that time it's too late to actually then think about our response. Maybe it's worthwhile thinking, what would be our response if we ever are forced to take up arms? It was I think only just some years back in the 1960s when we had something called the confrontation. The Indonesian soldiers landed on a beach near Port Dickson, and in that abortive attempt to conquer Malaysia. So actually, although we can say Malaysia is a very safe country, anytime we can be overrun in this context. So we want to look at this whole topic of, can war be justified? A biblical theological reflection and some contemporary challenges today. So what is war? Well, we need to have a working definition. Perhaps the simplest can be taken from the Webster Dictionary. It says war is a contest between nations or states. Now one can see that today in modern warfare, it has changed. The face of war has changed because sometimes it's no longer between just nations or states. But in the past, war was simply between two nations, carried out by force, whether for defense, for revenging insults, and addressing wrongs, for the extension of commerce, because sometimes we want to expand our borders in order to have more, for the acquisition of territory, for obtaining and establishing the superiority and the dominance of one over the other, or for any other purpose. It can be sometimes, you can say, for maybe not even a very important purpose. It can be sometimes for a very small purpose. Armed conflict of sovereign powers declared an open hospitality. So it's a good definition, but you can realize today war has changed a lot. when we look at war, because you can see there are different types of war. Okay, for example, we can have war that's offensive, one nation aggressively attacking another nation. So today we can see perhaps the best example is Russia attacking Ukraine, an offensive war where they are trying to increase their territory. And of course, Ukraine then on their side is doing what we call a defensive war, basically to repel invasion or the attacks of an enemy. And sometimes some wars are very public, two states openly declare we're going to war. Okay, it's not a covert, quiet war that goes on sometimes in many parts of the world. And we can also have civil war within the country, not an invasion by another state or country, but between different sections and parties of the same country. And one can see that Malaysia, we can easily also cross this fine line and descend into civil war if we're not careful, especially on the lines of religion and race. So what is the typical response to war and violence? Well, one can see straight away there's a broad spectrum. I think when the war broke out in Ukraine, you can determine in the church and even in the public various responses. Everybody has their own idea. Some will probably be pro for war, and maybe some will be against anti-war. So there's a whole spectrum from all-out war to no war at all. If we were to use some terms of convenience, those who think that war is always okay and always allowed, then you may be on what we call the militarist position or the war activist position. And there are some who will say no war at all and no war allowed at all, and that is total pacifism. But in the middle, you do find other positions like defensivism, which means they say, well, as an act of self-defense, okay, it might be permissible to go to war to defend ourselves. And some people will argue that maybe pacifism, no war at all, may be unrealistic. Maybe there are occasions when we may be permitted to go to war. Let me share that when I first started off as a Christian, I probably took the view of total pacifism, because you read the Bible, you realize, we are supposed to be people of peace. But through the years, as I grow older and I begin to think about some of these issues, I think I move on now perhaps to this position of conditional pacifism. Because I will actually say to myself, I don't think I'll be the one person who can just stand there and not do anything if my country is invaded by another country. Okay, because some Christians will say no war at all. So if a nation attacks us, we should not even take out arms. You just let them come and welcome them. I would say no. I will probably take up arms to defend my family and my nation. So maybe there may be certain conditions. So I'll probably move to this somewhere into the middle, something called conditional pacifism. When we think about the church, you find also a broad spectrum. In fact, sometimes we can be so divided in the church. You will find that there are some who says war is okay. So when the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, I was surprised to find that there were some Christians who fully support Putin and says that no, he's allowed to go to war on the ground of trying to denazify Ukraine. You find that some Christians do think that it is allowed. Well, of course, there are those other Christians who take the view of pacifism, like a dove. They say, no, all forms of violence is to be rejected. Disputes should be settled with peace. Okay, but maybe there is a Christian middle way between being militarist and being totally pacifist. There might be a middle way where we are allowed to what we call do selective participation and selective obedience. I'll come back to these two words later on, because I think that is perhaps a key to a proper response to war. Selective participation in wars, that means not all wars are permissible. And then selective obedience. Even though my country may say, no, we're going to war against Singapore and we're going to take over Singapore, I will probably say, no, I will disobey the government in this case because it is not a justified war. So it means selectively in this point, I will disobey and I'll probably need to go to jail for disobeying the government. So there might be a place for what we call selective obedience and selective participation. So when we look at what the Bible teaches about war and violence, the Old Testament is, of course, the area where it is often very contentious. One must remember the Old Testament comes from the context of wars and invasions. If ever there's a motto for this period, it is conquer or be conquered. Okay, let me be realistic. Israel lived in the middle of, you can say that the Levant, which stretches from the two rivers, Euphrates and Tigris, all the way towards the river Nile. And you find that moon-shaped, that crescent-shaped piece of land that is called the Levant. And that is the one place where you find the most wars taking place in the ancient world, because that is the land bridge between Europe, Asia, and Africa. If Egypt in Africa wants to conquer land in the Middle East, in Assyria, they will bypass and walk through where Israel is, Palestine, that geographical area, because that's a land bridge. And when you find Greece and Rome coming from Europe and coming by land, they will still cross down same way again to the land bridge to go to either the Middle East or to Egypt. So the very place of Israel itself was problematic because it was a path where people all walk on. So Israel was allowed to participate in select wars. So that in a certain section of the Old Testament, you find that there was such a war which we use the Hebrew word harem. And you can see very similar to the Arabic word haram. Arabic and Hebrew are actually Semitic languages and they share a lot of common similarities. Harem, of course, is a word which means ban. Something that is banned. It means there is a ban placed upon certain people or certain things, and Israel is not supposed to even touch them or even cover anything of them, or everything belongs to God. And so in that holy war, it was a one-time limited war declared by God to the Israelites. And it occurred in the context of the books of Joshua, Judges, and a little bit of First Samuel for a twin purpose. Okay, so one can see therefore this war is not a war that is repeated outside of that original purpose. In the time of the 10th century, when Israel had come out of Egypt to the Exodus, and they now make their way back to the Promised Land, and God then used them to fight these wars in order to gain the land. So there were two reasons why the Holy War was allowed to be carried out by the Israelites. One, the people of God, the Israelites, will become the agent of divine judgment upon the select nations, which means God was judging the nations like the Ammonites, the Amorites, the Edomites, the Philistines, the Phoenicians, the Arameans. So Israel happened to be just an agent to be the bearers of divine judgment upon those nations. And then at the same time, it was to possess back the land that had been promised to Abraham, because Abraham was promised the north and the south and the east and the west of the length and breadth of that land. But when people went down to Egypt to escape the famine for almost 400 years, the land didn't become empty. It was populated by other people of the land. So by the time they came back in around 1200 BC, the land is not empty. The land is filled with people. So in order to possess the land, they have to drive out the local inhabitants. So harem was therefore given to the people of God to carry out. And you notice this order to holy war is never repeated any time in the Bible. It's never given to people like David, Solomon, or to the kings of Israel and Judah. It's never an order that is repeated outside those few books, which I think therefore is something for us to think about. Because in the Middle Ages, when Pope Urban II declared war, especially on the Crusades, to regain back Jerusalem and the Holy Land, they declared that this was holy war, as in the manner of the books of Joshua. And I think in the First and Second War of Iraq, where US invaded Iraq, and some people were using the same terminology, holy war. I think it's wrong, because it's a one-time order given by God, and I don't think it's ever repeated. We are not called to go to holy war. So therefore, one has to be very careful to say that this war is a holy war and God has allowed us to exterminate and kill the people. We also find the fact that God is a divine warrior. He is the Yahweh Sabaoth. Sabaoth is the Hebrew word for hosts or the heavenly armies. He's the Lord of the heavenly armies. He's a divine warrior whose arm can, his arm can man a bow of bronze. And he fights on Israel's behalf, Deuteronomy 20 verse 4. Okay, so you can't run away from language of war in the Old Testament. It was a context of conquer or be conquered. But you find that in the midst of war and with injunction to go to war, there's also that commandment, the sixth command, thou shalt not murder. Okay, we never said thou shalt not kill. Kill and murder are two different Hebrew words. Okay, in the sixth command, they use the word for murder, which means you do not do premeditated, and you do not kill just excessively, because life is sacred. Only if God were to order you, perhaps then maybe it's permissible at certain times. So it's not all out scale license to kill. We are all not James Bond license to kill. We don't have the 00 number to us. And we also find that God is God of peace, shalom, one who desires peace for all men, in Isaiah 52 verse 7. So although the injunctions of war can be found in the Old Testament, it is always tempered with peace. The best chapter is from Deuteronomy chapter 20. Deuteronomy is a book which is basically Moses' 3 farewell speeches. Moses is about to die, and the people will cross over under the guidance of Joshua. And Moses anticipates that when you go to the promised land, you will have all these different scenarios, and there'll be times for war, and well, he gives them guidelines. One can see from, for example, chapter 20 of Deuteronomy, that when you go to war, there are certain exemptions for people, exemptions from joining the army. So in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 5 to 8, it says, if there is any man who has built a new house and not dedicated, let him go back to his house lest he die in battle and another man dedicated. It means if you happen to build a new house and you never even actually stay in the house, then you are exempted from war, because you go to war and then you die, then you actually don't get to dedicate your own house. And then there's another exemption. If a man has planted a vineyard and has not yet enjoyed its fruit, then let him go back to his house, lest he die in battle and another man enjoy his fruit. Or very good excuse that, I planted a nice vineyard, I'm waiting for the grapes to ripen, and then now I'm called to go to war, and then if I die, then I'll never come back to taste my grapes. Well, you are exempted to go to war in that case. A third one is, if any man who has betrothed a wife and has not taken her, then he can go back to his house, lest he die in battle and then another man take her. That means if you engage to your wife and you have not even consummated your marriage, then of course you are exempted from war. And the fourth one is, if there's a man who is fearful and faint-hearted, then let him go back to his house, lest he make the heart of his fellows melt like his own. That means if you're afraid, well, that can spread, and you can then actually maybe even lose the war, because you cause your brothers to be afraid. So you then can be exempted from going to war. Very interesting. You get 4 exemptions for certain people not to go to war. And then in 10 to 12, when you draw near to a city to fight against it, always offer terms of peace. That means you sue for peace, as we often use that term. That means it is to say, here if we are besieging a city, if you can avoid war in the first instance and then sue for peace, go ahead and do it. Okay, and if the city responds to you in peace and it opens to you, then all the people there are spared. You don't have to kill them. Instead, then you can force them to do forced labor for you. If it does not make peace with you, then make war against you, then you shall besiege it. So that means the first instance is if you can avoid war, avoid war. Okay, sue for peace first. Then 13 to 15 and 16 to 18 talks about the nations located either within the promised land, that means the geographical area of Palestine or Canaan, and the nations outside of those lands. Now, remember there were neighboring nations within the promised land when Israel came to conquer. There were the people towards the west, like the Philistines and the Phoenicians at the sea. Then there were people on the east, like the Edomites towards the south, and then the Moabites, and then the Ammonites, Amorites, and then towards the north, east, the Arameans. So there are nations within and there are nations without the promised land. And you find that there are two categories here. In the first category, when the Lord gives it to your hand, you should put all of his males to the sword. That means you kill all the male, but the women and the children, the livestock and everything in the city, all the spoil you should take as plunder for yourself, and you should enjoy the spoil. Okay, those are outside the promised land, far away. Then when you go to war, you can spare the children and the women and all this. But you find that in 1618, in the cities which are within the promised land, that one is the total ban, the harem. Okay, and these are the nations, the seven nations: the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. So there is a distinction in that sense as well. And then finally, verse 19 to 20 on the protection of nature. Because in times of war, the soldiers will cut down trees to use as weapons to make siege instruments, to make battering rams, and then they will use it for firewood. And so they will end up cutting a lot of trees, especially fruit trees. And here you have that order, you shall not destroy trees by wielding an axe against them. You may eat from them, but you shall not cut them down. Okay, so even the environment is supposed to be spared, so that you do not do what we call scorched earth policies, where you burn everything. And because a scorched earth policy is actually very, very effective. In the World War II, Germany was attacking Russia and they were almost winning. Then winter time came and the Russians did a very smart move. They practiced scorched earth policy. They burned everything in their midst as they withdrew. So that when the German army came and they so-called conquered those lands, those lands were all burned. There was nothing left. There were no trees, not even anything that could be eaten. So you are victorious. You won that all those lands, but all those lands are useless. And so scorched earth policy is very destructive. And in fact, Judah, which was destroyed by the Babylonians, and there the nation then went to exile in Babylon. When they returned 50 years later, you find that the nation never fully recovered. There was still famine in the land. You just have to read Haggai chapter 1 and 2. And you can see how the people struggle. God says, no, you look for the produce of the land. Doesn't it slip through your fingers like sand? There was just widespread famine, continuing famine. So when you go to war, therefore, even the environment ought to be protected. So you find it's a very interesting chapter to look at. That means when you go to war, be careful. Okay, if you can avoid war at all costs, protect the nature, and then certain people can be exempted to go to war, and then the treatment you give to nations located within the promised land and those outside the promised land. We don't have time to cover the intertestamental period, something which I covered in the previous seminar in 2015. It's very interesting to actually look at the intertestamental period between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and that's the time that you have a very important war that took place, the Maccabean revolt. For 5 years, the Jewish people struggled against the Seleucid Empire. The Greeks who stay in Damascus formed from the general Seleucus. They had conquered Palestine and they were fighting this war. And from there, you find a new idea began to emerge, the idea of martyrdom. Okay. Second Maccabees chapter 8 talks about a mother who had 7 sons and how the 7 sons all refused to compromise their faith. and the Greek soldiers killed all the 7 sons one by one in front of the mother. Okay, so martyrdom was something to be encouraged and to look for. Okay, and perhaps that was the background to why we find martyrdom also spoken of in the New Testament. But when you swing to the New Testament, we find, of course, it is still located in the context of war because it is the Roman Empire. But the Roman Empire had done its work. They have conquered all the nations around, and they have given the known world something called Pax Romana, Roman peace. And so when the gospel came at the time of the turn of the century, there was already peace in the empire. Okay, and so you find Jesus talk less about war but more about peace. And the Sermon on the Mount, of course, is one of the notable topics about how we do the reverse. We turn the other cheek, we walk the second mile. And then Paul also talks about those who persecute us, we should bless them. We do not repay evil with evil. In fact, we should actually learn to overcome evil with good. And Peter, a fellow exile, writing to the exiles in the diaspora, again in the midst of persecution in the empire by other people, he wrote and told them, well, we have Jesus as an example. Jesus didn't revile in return. He didn't even threaten. So we follow the example of Jesus. If ever there is a need for force to resist or to punish violence, that should be something entrusted to the government. Romans 13 talks about the government as the servant of God, and they are the ones to ensure justice is carried out. So should we take vengeance? No. Like what Deuteronomy 32 says, and which Romans 12:19 picks up, vengeance belongs to the Lord. So we should leave that to God to deal with it. I think that's a very good reason why, because humanly speaking, whenever we take vengeance in our hands, sometimes we cannot control ourselves. We can go overboard. In carrying out vengeance, sometimes we can be consumed by it, and we can actually end up losing sight of mercy. So instead of aggression, the gospel message is about love and mercy. That is to temper the justice. So basically, by the time we move to the New Testament, we are now no longer talking so much about war in the sense of conquer, be conquered. We talk about, well, even if we have to suffer, we suffer because we believe in the gospel of peace, shalom, and we follow the example of agape, divine love. But, well, so far so good. So when the early Christians began to live in the Roman Empire, you find that most of them probably would avoid military and police service because it involves violence. So they will have probably stayed away from it. Things began to change when Constantine became the Roman emperor. Christianity became the majority religion, the state religion. And when Christianity became the state religion, you find that Christians began to serve in government. Christians also began to serve in the military and in the police force. And here is where you have a conundrum, because then you are faced with sometimes that difficult challenge. Should you take part in violence? What if the government order us soldiers, in both Christians and non-Christians, to use violence on a certain group of people? Should we obey the government? Okay, so there began to be struggles. How do you balance the philosophy of Rome and the Christian principles? I think the turning point was the invasion of the barbaric hordes on the Roman Empire, the fall of Rome to the Visigoths, a barbaric tribe from Germany area. And the fall of Rome here raised very urgent questions, because you have the whole issue of then, can we go to war? In fact, can war ever be just or immoral? Which is where we today pick up this question to look at. Can Christians take up arms and participate in war and violence? I mean, after all, it is for noble purpose, to defend the country, to defend our loved ones. So some of the early Christian theologians began to struggle with this issue, and their response is to develop what we call the just war theory. There were three very famous just war theories. So you can guess the pictures here. We have Saint Ambrosius, which is Ambrose of Milan, and then you have Saint Augustine, and then you have Thomas Aquinas. Okay. Time does not permit us to look at all three in depth, so I'll begin with the first, but we'll focus on the third. Bishop Ambrose of Milan was actually a very reluctant bishop. He didn't even want to be bishop. It was tradition said that when he was announced that he was a bishop, he was forcibly carried by two wardens of the church on both arms and taken by force to be to be ordained as a bishop. But it turned out to be a great bishop. Okay, he's one of the famous Latin fathers, and he struggled with the issue of legitimization of war because Constantine had become a Christian, and you can see Ambrose lived around that period. And when Christianity became the official religion of Rome, then you have this struggle. How do we reconcile the philosophy of Rome, being an empire, and being an empire, you go to war to expand your borders. Okay, so Rome readily accepted war. Then how do you balance that with the traditions and the principles of Christianity? We talked about love your enemies, do not go to war. So he was the first to struggle with this and to address the whole important issue of when is war just? Okay, so he wasn't even asking the question, can war be just? He's asking the question, when is war just? And if war is just, then how should it be carried out? Now, notice it's a case. That means if there is legitimate reasons to go to war, how do we carry out that war? Okay, and within 40 years, within 30 years, Saint Augustine continued on that thinking. Augustine is regarded as a father of the Western theory of just war. He developed the two very famous guidelines regarding war in order to make war just and moral as possible. How do we make war as just and moral as possible? So the two conditions are, of course, in Latin, just ad bellum and just ad bello. And I think our brother Philip can explain a little bit more about this. Justice before the war and justice during the war, which means to ensure that war remain moral and just, there must be certain conditions before we go to war, justice before the war. And then when war is going on, we must also ensure that there is justice during the war. Because sometimes the war can develop and this escalate into something terrible. Okay, it can be excessive killing and maybe excessive violence and use on it. Then it's not justified at all. So therefore, you look at conditions before the war and during the war. Okay, but what is interesting for us that we're going to focus is more of the just ad bellum, justice before the war. Okay, and Augustine lists out 4 conditions that must be met before war can be just and moral. Okay, first one, you must have a just cause, a good reason, being a last resort, like what Deuteronomy talks about, sue for peace first before going to war, being declared by a proper authority. Of course, in that case, it was a pope at the time, and then possessing the right intention. Your motives of going to war must be correct and right. Okay, so those were his 4 conditions, and you can see the 4, of course, today has expanded to 6 in modern times. We have added 2 more, which is 4 and 5. There must be a reasonable chance of success too when you go to war. Because if you look at it and the chances of success in the war is very slim, then you shouldn't go to war at all because you're going to lose. And then it must be proportionate to the amount of force you use. Okay, so today we add 2 more to the 6. Okay, and then of course in the just bello he gives 3. Okay, so Augustine laid the foundation, but we will turn to Thomas Aquinas, who belonged to the school of what we call scholasticism. He was nicknamed the Ox. When he was young, he wasn't really bright, but he became really one of the great legal minds and one of the great thinkers of the Middle Ages. And Aquinas picked up this whole idea and continued, and he wrote, especially in his Summa Theologica. So I left a link to the internet. There is the whole book is all the volumes of the book are actually placed on the internet, and you can actually go and look at it. It's a bit confusing to find it first because it's under headings and subheadings, but you can, but that link will lead you straight to that page where it concerns the whole issue. So at that point, he says, we must now consider war, under which there are 4 points of inquiry. So there are 4 questions to ask. And of course, it's the first question that we are more concerned with. First question is whether some kind of war is lawful. Second question is whether it is lawful for clerics to fight. Can pastors, priests go to war? Thirdly, whether it is lawful for the belligerent to lay ambushes. That means, there are these people, the riffraff, those who are who practice underhanded ways, and then sometimes they use all these underhanded means in war. And so is it right for them to lay an ambush in all this? And then fourthly, whether it's lawful to fight on holy days. That was an important concern for them. So what if war crossed over into Christmas? Do we fight on December 25th? So there was a very interesting movie made of a real incident in the First World War, where the Allies were fighting against the Axis, and on December they actually stopped fighting, and the German soldiers and the British soldiers came out of their trench and actually celebrated Christmas together, and they end up having a football match on that day itself. But when December 25th ended, they went back to their trench, and the next day they continued fighting. Of course, which to me was really very stupid. If we can agree to play football together on Christmas Day, why then continue on to fight? So he gives answers to those questions, which you can see. For example, like question 2, is it lawful for pastors and priests to fight? He says, no, warlike pursuits are altogether incompatible with the duties of bishops and clerics, because we are supposed to be focused on the issue of preaching the gospel of peace, so we shouldn't go to war, okay? Leave the war to the other members. Then thirdly, he says, well, ambush can be lawfully employed in a just war, okay? And then fourthly, it is lawful to carry war on holy day, provided there's a need. That means if the enemy attacks me and use a very low blow, attack me on December 25th, Christmas Day, then I'm permitted to fight even on Christmas Day. That's what he says. But it's the first question that concerns us, because it talks about whether some kind of war is lawful. Okay, so whether it is always sinful to wage war, because is it ever wrong to go to war at all, or not wrong to war? So he tackles objections first. He anticipates objections from people, and there are 4 objections that people will probably give. One objection, of course, based on Matthew 26:52, where you live by the sword, you die by the sword. There's the story of Peter cutting off the ear of the high priest's servant. That is always sinful to wage war. If you live by violence, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. So some people argue war, therefore, should never be permitted. It's a sin. A second objection which he anticipated was that whatever is contrary to divine precept is sin. That means if it's not part of what is God's law, then it is sin. Because God's law is spelled out in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, and in Romans 12, law goes against God's will. The objection which he anticipates is nothing except sin is contrary to an act of virtue. War is contrary to peace, so war cannot be virtuous. Only peace is virtuous. Okay. A fourth objection that he anticipates, the exercise of a lawful thing is itself lawful, but war is not a lawful thing, therefore war is a sin. So he anticipates that people will object to war using the 4 objections. But then he believes, like Augustine, that there might be certain conditions in which war can be justified. Remember, Augustine gave 4 conditions. Aquinas dropped one of it and only used 3 of the conditions when war can be just. And he changed the order of priority so that number 1, when war is begun on proper authority. So in that original context of the Catholic Church, the Pope would be the proper authority. If the Pope were to declare war, that means war has been declared on a proper authority, then it is a just war. And that explains why in the First Crusade, Pope Urban II was the one that declared war, and the churches and the Roman Emperor and the kings of the nations all acted on it. Okay. The second then is when there is a just cause to war. Okay, so that means but there must be a just reason, a legitimate reason. And then thirdly, when it's waged with the right intention, your motives must be correct. Aquinas dropped the fourth one, which is war as a last resort, suing for peace, because he thinks that if it's always just last resort, that means we have to exhaust all earlier means first. It might be a bit dangerous because then we can be overrun by the enemy. Because if we are so busy trying to sue for peace and trying to negotiate for peace, the enemy will be building up the arsenal. And like actually what happened in World War II, Richard Chamberlain, Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of England, made a peace treaty with Hitler, and he came back and he said, no, war will be averted. But it was not genuine because Hitler was using that to just delay the inevitable. They were already stockpiling and getting the things ready. And of course, Winston Churchill, who had lost the election and was not the prime minister, growled, and actually thought it was really a very bad error. And in fact, it was true because when Germany went to war, Neville Chamberlain actually stepped down because he realized that he got caught into it. So perhaps August Aquinas think that fourth condition, war is last resort, may not be workable. If we have these first three conditions, then war can be just. Today, modern proponents take all four and add two more to it. Okay, you must have a reasonable chance of success. That means if you weigh the options and you realize that the enemy is far too big, more powerful than you, then you have no chance of success, then you should not go to war. And then the means to conduct it must be proportional to that ends. That means you cannot like shoot a mosquito with an elephant gun. Some people do that. They use excessive force to get achieve the means. So modern proponents of just war think that war can be and ought to be guided by moral principles, and they should be that means we should think of war on a broader, more dispassionate, and a more philosophical point of view. Well, easier said than done. So back to the whole issue, can war be moral or just? For war to be just, if you look at the modern proponents, people like Walzer, they will say, okay, if we take all the six conditions, war is allowed when you're being attacked first. War must be a last resort. War must have peaceful intentions. War is permissible when rescuing people under aggression. War is allowed when promoting good or avoiding evil. War must be formally declared and waged by a legitimate authority. So perhaps in the modern day context, they say if these six conditions can be met, then war is permitted and that war can be just and moral. So take the examples. If let's say if the president of the country or the king of the country declare war, then of course he is the legitimate authority of the country, then he can formally declare war and wage war. And then the war is, if it promotes good and avoid evil, then war is allowed. Of course, promoting good and avoiding evil depends on perspective. Whose perspective that you look at? Some people will say it is good, but is it only my good? But no, it's like what is good to me is bad news to you. See, then war is permissible when you're trying to rescue people from aggression, and that's where sometimes US uses that reason. When Kuwait was invaded by Iraq, US used that reason in the first Iraq war to rescue the people under aggression. War must have peaceful intentions. That means we have to go to war in order to end the war. We go to war to end a war, peaceful intentions. Okay, war must be a last resort. Okay, so today we do have diplomacy. We have the United Nations, and we are supposed to exhaust all diplomatic channels first before we actually should go to war. And war is allowed when you're being attacked first. So in a sense, therefore, if a foreign country invade our country, then we are allowed a defensive war. We can declare war to defend ourselves because we've been attacked. So you can see that it's easier said than done. But we will find that, well, some of the conditions will be met. And does that mean, therefore, we can go to war? So our response will still depend on what positions we hold. Because if we are Christians, we find that there are some Christians who are on one end of the spectrum. You have many Christians, for example, in the US, who believe that guns and possessing guns and firearms is okay because it's allowed in the Constitution. And they will die. They will actually fight to the death to defend the constitutional right to bear arms and to. So, some parts of the world, some Christians believe that it's okay to go to war and to fight and all this. But there are others you find that we don't. So within America, you also have the Mennonite community who refuse to go to war during the Second World War, and they prefer to be imprisoned, to be sent to prison for not joining the draft, okay, to go to war. And so many of them therefore serve in the prison. And of course, in prison, they began to serve in the health facilities. And that's where, of course, the Mennonites today are very famous for their health services because they started all this as a response. And maybe perhaps as Christians, we have to say, well, we still have to selectively participate and selectively obey, okay? And there are times maybe I may have to go against even the legitimate authority, which is perhaps the president or the king or the prime minister of my country. So it's not as easy as we say. So let's look at one modern example, the Catholic Church. The heir of the Catholic Church in the past, the Catholic Church has a catechism which has reached the second edition. If you look at the paragraphs, like many discipline, they have these different paragraphs. 2307 to 2309 talks about the issue of war. So the title is called Avoiding War. And 2307 talks about the fifth commandment, which forbids intentional destruction of human life. Okay, because it's not the sixth commandment, it's a fifth, because the way they count the 10 commandments is very different. They split the last one, thou shalt not covet your neighbor, your wife, thou shalt not covet, all the thing. They split the 10 commandments into two, and they drop the first one about I am the Lord your God. So the accounting of the 10 commandments is slightly different. So thou shalt not murder becomes fifth commandment for them, whereas for many of us in the Protestant church, we divide the 10 commandments, it becomes a sixth commandment. Okay, so it looks as if they're quoting the wrong one, but it's not. So thou shalt not murder forbids intentional destruction of human life. And so the church here urges everyone to pray first. Only action if divine goodness can free us from war. So that means that you seek peace first. Then all citizens and all governments are obliged to work for avoidance of war. Okay, do all we can to pursue and use diplomatic channels or whatever. As long as the danger of war persists and there is no international authority with the necessary competence and power, governments cannot be denied the right of lawful self-defense once all peace efforts have failed. So the Catholic Church does agree that there are times when all peaceful efforts fail and a government has a right to lawful self-defense, so they can therefore go to what we call a defensive war. So we're not talking about therefore wars of aggressive war, but more of defensive wars. Then 2309, what are the conditions? Okay, the Catholic Church lists out this. What are the conditions for a legitimate defense by military force? Requires rigorous consideration because, as I say, this is a very heavy decision to make. Okay, it says here, if you ever were to go to war, at one and the same time, the four things must happen. Damage inflicted by the aggressor on a nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. It means it must be a war in which it cannot be prolonged and stretched, like the 100-Year War. You know, in those days, in history, you have this 100-year war which dragged on and on and on. No, war should be decisive. It should just achieve its ends, and then you achieve the goals, and then you end the war once you have achieved the goals. All other means of putting end to it must have been shown to be impractical. It means you have exhausted all channels first before you ever declare to go to war. There must be serious prospects of success. That means if you know that you cannot win the war and you cannot achieve those goals, then don't go to war, because you're not going to get those aims in the first place. Use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than evil to be eliminated. That means you cannot use excessive force, which will escalate the war and make the war even more worse than the initial war. Okay, and the power of modern means of destruction weighs very heavily in evaluating this crime, because you have to be very careful. As I say, you end up using very destructive wars. For example, you get invaded by an army and they only use foot soldiers and infantry, to attack country. But then when you respond, you go drop nuclear bombs on them and whack everybody out. That is a disproportionate use of force. Okay, so here, therefore, this whole issue is to call us to think about carefully how we respond. So the Catholic Church is still struggling today from using what they have inherited from Ambrose, Augustine, Aquinas, and they've developed their own so-called just war teaching in the Catechism, which is very interesting, because coming from the Methodist Church, we Methodists also have what we call a book of discipline, and we have a social creed, and we do have some statements there that talks about our response to war, but nothing as detailed as what the Catholic Church does. So I'm not sure about other churches, whether you have a set of conditions and a sort of guidelines to help you to respond, so that if ever war does happen, then what is the stand of your church? So when we evaluate this condition, one can see ultimately it falls back upon the person as the response. Remember, every Christian will differ in their response. No two Christians will totally agree. Okay. Apart from politics, which also divide Christians, the issue of war and violence also divide Christians. Each one of us must respond, I think, with a clear conscience. And here is where I come back to the two criteria for us to use as a response to the just war. Even though conditions can be met, but it can be declared by perhaps your head of state, who may be a dictator, a tyrant. Well, nevertheless, he's a legitimate source of authority, but then he is a tyrant, a dictator, and he's declaring a war of aggression on others. And you being a citizen, you are drafted into the army to fight. So doesn't mean, therefore, we just have to blindly obey our leaders and our nation and go to war. I think here, because of that individual clear conscience, all of us have to respond to our own conscience. Here's where we come back to the two criteria that I pointed out earlier. Selective participation, when to join in to fight and when to abstain. Okay, that means we have to say, in some wars, I can participate, but some wars, I cannot participate. Okay, because it goes against my conscience, or it is not a war of defense, but a war of aggression. So I have to be selective in my participation. And then, of course, it ties in with selective obedience, knowing when to obey or disobey. There are times when if our country is attacked and the government calls upon all able-bodied men and women and children to defend the country, then we know that it is an opportunity to obey. But if our country actually declares war on another sovereign, and it is a war of aggression in order to assimilate that country, then maybe here we have to say, no, I will disobey the government, and to the point of perhaps even going to prison for the sake of disobedience. So I think we have to be governed on in this area here, not just by conditions which the just war theory sets out, which help us as a guidelines, but basically, it still come down to us. Each of us will have to say, can I participate in this war? And should I obey or disobey the call to go to war? So, why do I say that? Is because in the world today, there are new challenges. And so the question is the just war tradition still adequate? Is the just war theory still applicable to these new challenges? For example, the just war theory was something developed in the past, almost 1,000 years ago. And in those wars, the enemy was something that's external. Okay, a country that comes and attack you from and invades your country. But in modern times, the enemy is a new face. Okay, for example, it's a war that takes on the religious aspect, religious insurgency. It is a war which on the basis of religion. I disagree with your religion, and then it can be something now what we call international terrorism. There's no borders. Okay, Al Qaeda, ISIS, all these don't have borders. They're not a country itself. You can't define them. They cross borders. And then there are some wars which are fought not because of military or whatever. They're drug wars. Okay, you fight against drug lords who protect their territory and their possession, and it's a war that you end up with. That can split a country apart, like in Central America. There are covert war operations conducted in your territory by another country against maybe another country, but using your country, and you end up being a participant in the covert wars. And what is our response to that? There's also war by proxy. Okay, today you don't fight, but you hire mercenaries to fight for you. Now that of course changes a lot of the dynamics. And then there's also what we call limited military operation. It's just a little bit to incursion into your territory and then be pulled back after we achieve our means. It's not a full-scale start a war where we come and annex the thing, but it's just a limited operation. Now, how does just war operate in those contexts? And then today, in modern warfare, we are talking about weapons of mass destruction. In old days, it was just infantry, foot soldiers, cavalry, horses, and chariots. And then, of course, you begin to have siege machines, the battering ram, the trebuchet, those sling machines. But today, we're talking about mass destruction, weapons of mass destruction. A press of the button will declare nuclear war, or using ballistic and cruise missiles that are so smart they can find where you are. That's what happened today in the Gaza Strip war with Israel. They were able to pick out all those commanders because they use a cell phone, and those missiles pick up your signal. And then there's now drone warfare that's happening in Ukraine. Warfare by drones, which are manned by people far away looking at the screen. Okay, it's a different type of war. Okay, and so it's a different type of fighting altogether. You're not even present physically. And of course, Star Wars technology, which we will probably be seeing in the years to come, where you will have a satellite aiming at you from the sky, and then before you will realize it, you are burned to crisps by a laser beam. Okay, so again, this is a totally different type of war. And then what if the enemy that attacks the people is not an enemy from the outside, but within? And here's where I struggle with this because of the BER rallies. The enemy is not an invading force, but the enemy is perhaps, let's say, a government which has run authoritarian and does not take care of the rights of the people, and you are going against your own government. Okay, so how does just war theory here works? Because we think about Romans 12 and Romans 13. Then how do we maintain a common stand in the midst of diversity, even within the worldwide church? Because at least the Catholics have their so-called guidelines in their catechism, but we are not Catholics, we are Protestants. Okay, and if ever there's a war declared, for example, in Malaysia, the Catholics will be able to respond because they will turn to the catechism and to paragraph 2307, you have the guidelines. But what about us, Anglicans, Presbyterians, gospel haulers? We don't have sometimes guidelines like this, nor do we have a singular leader like the Pope that can hold together the whole Catholic Church. At least the Orthodox also have their own Orthodox bishops. We Protestants, we elect bishops, but they are not, they're only by terms. So there's a lack of an authoritative figure to declare war. to legitimize war. So we find therefore this condition does not meet. For example, let's take the Methodist Church which I come from. If Malaysia is, let's say, attacked by a country, and then my Methodist bishop declares that we should join the country, join the government to fight this war, some of us will then question, can my bishop have that type of authority to declare war for all the Methodist Christians? See, some of us will say, I never voted for him, so why should I obey him? See? So we find that we struggle because we don't have a single authoritative figure to run all this. So when we think about Malaysian church response, we are living in the midst of changing challenges because war has a new phase. We also are different because we have a very multi-pluralistic and multi-religious context, which is not like a single monolithic nation of people of just one race or one religion. Okay, we are multi-pluralistic and multi-religious, and that is very tricky. Okay, and if we were to follow the just war theory and try to apply them to modern day context, there will be serious consequences because do we expect everyone to obey? Do we expect some to consciously object and say, I will not join, even though you have your theory and you have your guidelines? How do we remain united? Okay. And of course, some of us will then say, oh, we should turn to prayer first. Yes, apart from praying and suing for peace and exhausting all diplomatic channels, how else can we be actively promoting peace and avoiding war as much as possible? Because we believe, as the Sermon on the Mount tells us, blessed are the peacemakers. But it doesn't mean that we should then just stay in the margins and not do anything. I like this cartoon here. You know, sometimes many of us Christians are like that. Just pray, dude. Just pray about it. And we do not even lend a hand, nor do we even jump to the water to assist the person. I don't think we can just stand aside and not do anything because, as we often remember the motto, evil prosper when good men do nothing. Albert Einstein, the one who have to create, in a way, the nuclear bomb, talks about peace. He says, peace cannot be just kept by force. It can only be achieved by understanding. So it means that just war theory is a way of responding to war and force and trying to legitimize force if certain conditions can be met. Okay, but apart from that, the best is still, if we can afford not to go to war, then peace should be the better options. So I leave for you 3 reflection questions to think about. What is your position with regards to violence and war? Because all of us will hold a different position. Some might be pro, some might be anti. Okay, do you agree with the just war theory? What Ambrose, Aquinas, and Augustine has formulated? Do you think it still works today? Well, the Catholic Church truly believes it. That's why they build it into the catechism. Then what can a Malaysian church do in response to conflicts, wars, and insurgencies around the world? Is just praying enough? Or can we do more? And what can we do more? Selective references. You want to find out more about Augustine, because Augustine is the father of the Western just war theory. That is a very good article on him. And then there's also another one here. And then there are also other good books for you to think about. Modern thinkers as well. Okay, modern thinkers like here, just war thinkers from Cicero all the way to the 21st century. Morality and war, can war be just? These are all modern thinkers. You have Christian views, Bruce Newton, Klaus, Brueggemann, and then you also have Richard Hess and Martin's War in the Bible and Terrorism. It was something that there was a symposium where the articles are all collected together. A new one written by a Korean, Divine War in the Old Testament and the Ancient Near East, look at the whole contexts of issue of war, because the larger context is, remember, conquer or be conquered. Those who want to find out more about Augustine, there is a book by Mattox as well. Nietzsche's book I already suggested. The modern thinkers, of course, evaluating people like Walzer. There is a good book by Parson, Walzer and Wall, reading Just and Unjust Wars today. And of course, Walzer's book, Just and Unjust Wars, a moral argument with historical illustration, which I think our brother Philip will have mouse to it, and he can probably say a bit more on it. Okay, so I'll pass it back to brother Philip.
Thank you, Dr. Low. This session is, in a way, unlike other sessions because you have brought us both to some biblical conspectus on the Old Testament and the New, obviously it cannot be comprehensive and exhaustive. And a quick glance at key Christian thinkers that have wrestled with these ideas and given us a short introduction. We are heirs to a rich tradition of thinkers and biblical scholars. And not all of us have the energy nor the access to those works you have shared. So this evening, we are indebted to your sharing that giving us some framing of the issues as we reflect on this. While we have time now for at least 20 minutes or so, I would like to invite anyone who would like to raise any issues. And you are welcome to make a comment. Try to keep it short so that others can also participate. May I invite anyone who wants to comment? If you have a look at the chat box, Dr. Look, there were some conversations going on while some of us multitask listening to you.
Okay.
And so they're not necessarily linked to you. But just to kick it off, there is a Catholic pastor known as Jagger Straster, Franz from Austria, who refused to serve in the army, and he was promptly executed. He was recently canonized. It's a kind of a sense of knowing that there is persons who refuse, in a way, perhaps to use another phrase, an idealized pacifism. We also know that from the Nazi